everyone, and thank you for joining us for yet another session of Coffee Chat, Thompson Hine's web series on matters related to the financial service industries. Today is Wednesday, December 13th. I hope your day is off to a great start. This is our final Coffee Chat for 2023. My name is Philip Sinning. I'm a partner in Thompson Hine's Investment Management Group, and I'm based here in Columbus, Ohio. The investment management team provides structural, transactional, and regulatory advice to participants in the investment management industry. A big part of our practice is to keep abreast of industry and regulatory developments and to interact with regulators. By all accounts, the SEC's rulemaking agenda has been very active. Some might even say it's been on fire for several years now, and the number of proposals, amendments, and rule adoptions have been unprecedented, and quite frankly, even a little dizzying at times. This year, 2023, was certainly no exception. In today's session, we'll look at two recently adopted rule amendments that take effect in the new year in 2024, namely amendments requiring tailored shareholder reporting and amendments to the names rule. Then we'll revisit a proposal that is still pending, but is expected to make a big impact on an increasingly popular market segment. I'm referring to, of course, the proposed ESG rule. Joining me to discuss these topics are two other members of the Thompson Hine Investment Management team, Parker Bridgeport, Senior Counsel here in Columbus, and Randy Gerlach, Associate in Chicago. Good morning, Parker and Randy.
Good morning, Philip.
Good morning, Philip.
To our audience, as a housekeeping matter, your microphones are muted to ensure the best sound quality. But if you have any questions or comments during today's program, please join in by using the chat box on your control panel. We will address your comments as we move through our discussion. However, if we don't have time for your question or we don't see it, please accept our apologies and know that we will follow up with you after the program. So let's get started with tailored shareholder reporting. In January of this year, the SEC's amendments to the rules and forms governing shareholder reporting went effective with a compliance date of July 24th, 2024. These amendments continue a theme of rules, amendments, and guidance from the SEC over several years that has been largely driven by a desire to deliver information to shareholders in a manner that is both accessible and, I would say, easily digestible. The SEC has always strived to make fund disclosures more accessible and digestible and simplified for investors, particularly those who might not be as financially savvy or familiar with industry jargon, and certainly to those retail investors who are not as familiar with the rules and regulations surrounding their investments. It is from this notion of making it easier for retail investors that we have, for example, summary prospectuses, which highlight information from a fund's more detailed statutory perspective. It is also from this same principle that SEC guidelines encourage us to draft prospectuses in plain English wherever possible. So, Randy and Parker, in that vein, the SEC had become critical of shareholder reports that were becoming increasingly dense and were easily in excess of 100 pages with really lengthy disclosures. I know the three of us have seen shareholder reports, particularly those with for large fund families or really any fund complex over 5 funds that easily exceed 100, if not maybe even 200 pages. The amendments to modernize shareholder reporting, much like the summary prospectuses then, are intended to create a more layered disclosure and provide shareholders with a snapshot of a particular fund class, and we'll come back to that later, a particular fund class, in a way that is, in the SEC's words, concise and visually engaging. So what do I mean by that? Well, unlike current shareholder reports, these tailored shareholder reports are intended to have less narrative and more graphics. The SEC wants funds to get right to the heart of the matter. So when you think of a shareholder report, nearly half of it, if not more than half, A big bulk is the schedule of investments and the financial statements. And then the other big part of the shareholder report are all the notes to the financial statements. The SEC seems to suggest that investors are getting very little bang for their buck, and they're not able to glean a lot of information from a lot of pages. So with tailored shareholder reporting, the focus will be on a graphical representation of holdings, a graphical representation of a fund class's net assets, a graphical representation of advisory fees and expenses, and a graphical representation of the portfolio turnover rate. So with all these graphs, that's how you achieve the visually engaging, or supposedly will achieve a visually engaging report. Now, as anyone who's ever looked at a flow chart or any type of kind of financial table, you know that the more arrows you add and the more footnotes and explanatory disclaimers you put to a chart, it doesn't really relay a lot of information. It might be engaging, but it's still hard to glean information. So that's where brevity and being concise comes into play. It really needs to be able to deliver meaningful information to investors from the get-go. That's not to say that these shareholder reports won't have still some narrative discussion. And so namely, any statement of material changes that affect the fund during the reporting period will be permitted or is required rather. The management's discussion of fund performance is also required. When I say material change, that's any change involving the fund name, investment goals, objectives, or policies, the expenses and fees, principal investment risks, the advisor, sub-advisor. Those are material changes that can be explained in narrative. And then lastly, of course, as part of the layered disclosure of always being able to provide more information when it's required or requested, we have to have a statement regarding the availability of additional information, either online or can be delivered to you free of charge. As I mentioned at the top of the program, the compliance date is July 2024, which means that funds with a fiscal period ending in May of 2024 will be the first to be implementing these tailored shareholder reports. There is no formal page limit or word count, but it is expected that these reports will be no more than 3 to 4 pages in length. And as a general matter, any additional item that is not expressly permitted by item 27A of Form N1A should not be included. The reports will be XBRL tagged to make them machine readable, and I know that fund administrators are quickly preparing templates for how these reports are going to look to get them ready for their rollout in 2024, their big debut. One other element I just wanted to point out is notably the SEC in adopting these rules have reversed course from Rule 30E3, which had permitted mutual funds and ETFs to make shareholder reports available electronically. These reports have to be mailed physically to shareholders.
Philip,
go ahead.
One quick question. How do these tailored shareholder reports work with the shareholder reports that we're used to seeing?
Yeah, so these are in addition to and not a replacement of those more fulsome shareholder reports that I described earlier. Those shareholder reports will no longer be, they have to be filed with the SEC and will be made available to shareholders upon request. They are on the same schedule though. So 60 days after a fiscal period end, funds will have to prepare these tailored shareholder reports and also their customary shareholder reports. While in theory the information from one report should be the same as the information that's put in the tailored shareholder report, it is going to require a lot more effort in ensuring consistency across all of the fund documents. Randy, as I mentioned earlier, these tailored shareholder reports are supposed to give snapshots of a particular share class. So that means if a fund has multiple share classes, it will have to issue a separate tailored shareholder report for each class. Each class will have its own 3 to 4 page report. There seems to be a trade-off here then, because then we'll have simplified reporting on the one hand, but now we'll also have many more reports now on the other hand. More paper, more mailing, The SEC thinks that the cost is going to be minimal, but nevertheless, there's going to be more fund documents. There's also an additional element of the amendments that I haven't discussed, and that requires that investment company fees and expenses in advertisements and sales literature need to be consistent with the prospectus fee table presentations, and they also have to be reasonably current. With all of these documents and forms, and with all of these things having to be consistent, it is going to require a lot more time and energy to make sure that all of these fund documents are accurate.
Philip, can I ask you to describe the requirements for performance benchmarks under the Tailored Shareholder Reports?
Yeah, so the final kind of component of these amendments to the Tailored Shareholder Report is this new definition of an appropriate broad-based securities market index. The rules adopted the proposed definition from the proposal and says that a broad-based index must track the overall applicable domestic or international equity or debt securities market. So let's break this down for a little bit. The justification in the adopting release is that while performance disclosure that includes an index based on a narrow segment might actually provide a more apt comparison to the fund itself, it actually doesn't give investors an idea of how that narrow segment fits in the broader market, in the larger picture. So in other words, the SEC wants investors to know not only how a fund does against its peers, but also how it does against the market as a whole. So funds that do not invest in a single overall market may include more than one broad-based market index, but they can use a blend of those indexes as their broad-based market index. They can still report the blended index as a secondary index, but it's not going to be a replacement of the broad-based index. The adopting release provided guidance on how to select an appropriate index for your fund. For example, they said an appropriate index may include components that do not directly overlap with the fund's investments, so long as they share the same economic characteristics of the fund's investments. But kind of short of that, the SEC declined to publish a list of permissible indexes, noting that the availability of broad-based indexes will change over time, and they purposefully left out criteria for a broad-based securities market index to allow it to be flexible to evolve over time. The one thing they did say, though, is that indices that are more narrowly tailored to specific sectors or industries, or that include characteristics such as growth, value, ESG, small or mid-cap, they will not be considered broad-based market indices under the amendments. And so you can include them, but only as secondary indices. With that, that kind of leads us into our next topic, the names rule. We had mentioned here that growth and value is not going to satisfy a broad-based market index test, but growth and value also popped up in another amendment to Rule 35D1. Randy, why don't you give our listeners an overview of the names rule amendment?
Thanks, Philip. So the new Rule 35D1 requires that funds adopt an 80% policy with respect to investments suggested by the fund's name. So the SEC believed that fund's name communicates a focus on the investments and an expectation in investors that the fund's investments will further that focus. So under the amended rule, the fund needs to define the terms used in its name in the prospectus and include the criteria for determining whether an investment falls within that definition. So the idea behind this was that a fund could use these definitions to differentiate itself from another fund that uses the same word. However, you can't be so unique that you're no longer using a plain English definition or an industry standard accepted definition. The SEC acknowledged that not all words or terms have plain English definitions or industry standards. The one they mentioned is Latin America. So that could be companies headquartered in Latin America or 50% revenue from Latin America. So a fund can have a little differentiation there, but its investment focus must still resonate with that area or that term. As Philip mentioned, growth and value is specifically mentioned in the release. The rule will no longer differentiate between an investment strategy and a type of investment. Therefore, growth and value now need to be included. So what the SEC is looking for is words that show a type of investment or investments in a particular industry or a geographic focus, or fund names that suggest that the fund's distributions are tax-free. This, however, does not apply to words like international, global, or balanced. These, the SEC acknowledged, are ways of creating a portfolio. These are not actually suggesting a focus of the fund. The SEC also, in the new release, changed the date to once a fund falls out of violation with its 80% policy, it has 90 days to get back in. This was a big change, as it used to be a fund had to continuously comply with its 80% policy. So a fund will have to comply under normal circumstances or at the time it invests. Now, the SEC didn't say what is a normal circumstance versus what is a non-normal circumstance. However, so a fund could, in theory, violate its 80% policy purposely under a non-normal circumstance, and then would have 90 days from that violation to get back into compliance. However, the rule release mentions if you're continuously violating under non-normal circumstances, it brings into question how non-normal those circumstances are, and ultimately leads to the idea that you would need to change your name because your investment is not actually focused on that term as you say you are.
So in essence, Randy, it sounds like if there's a temporary defensive measure or a reaction to the market where you have to move to cash and you can't keep 80% in your 80% policy, that would be a non-normal circumstance that required you to intentionally deviate from your 80% policy. But so long as you can course correct, or hopefully the market corrects so that you can get back within 90 days, then you haven't violated the names rule.
Exactly.
Right. So when do funds need to comply with these amendments?
So the rule became effective this past Monday, December 11th. Fund groups with assets over $1 billion will have 24 months to comply. Fund groups with assets under $1 billion will have 30 months. After compliance date comes in, new funds will have 180 days from their launch to become compliant with their 80% policy. I recognize this 24 months and 30 months seems like a long time, but a lot of this stuff, the groundwork is going to need to be laid well in advance. So we certainly would recommend that people start thinking about this, if not right now, in the near future, to get the record keeping requirements and everything set so that when their compliant date comes up, they're ready to go.
And is there are these 80% policies mutable? Can they be changed?
They can be changed. They would need votes. As we noted, particularly 80% policies require a 60-day notice to shareholders before they can be changed. So again, it's not something that can just be done overnight.
Thank you, Randy. That brings up another question. How are derivatives treated under the amended names rule?
Yeah, so generally you have to use the notional value of the derivative for determining whether it falls into your 80% basket. But unlike the proposed amendments, certain derivatives that hedge a currency risk for a foreign denominated currency are excluded. Another change from the proposed rule is that a fund may deduct cash and cash equivalents with maturities of a year or less. The change is that they are allowed to do this. Under the proposed rule, they would have been required to do this.
Randy, I have a question about certain names, certainly growth, value you mentioned. What about ESG terms like sustainable or socially responsible? How are those impacted or affected by the names rule?
Yeah, so perhaps the most notable part of the names rule was that the ESG ban on names in the ESG integration funds was not included in the final rule that came out. However, the SEC specifically notes that ESG terms in a name would require an 80% test, so they're not excluded from this rule.
Got it. Well, Randy, you mentioned integration funds in that response, and that kind of begs the question of what is an integration fund? And for that, I think we'll turn to Parker. Parker, can you explain the silos of ESG funds as proposed under the proposed ESG rule?
Sure, Philip. For a historical reference, on the same day in May 2022 as the SEC published the proposing release for the amendments to the names rule, it also proposed a new set of rules that have become known as the ESG rule. The goal of the ESG rules is to require more precise disclosures by funds that follow an ESG strategy with a goal of preventing greenwashing. Greenwashing being a catch-all industry term for the notion that a fund may purport to follow ESG principles, but does not genuinely do so. The ESG rule functions by proposing expanded ESG-related disclosures primarily through a fund's prospectus, but also in annual reports and Form NSEN. Analogous disclosures would be required for investment advisors, but that is beyond the scope of today's coffee chat. The rule functions initially by classifying ESG-related funds into two main silos. Integration funds, which were discussed earlier, those are funds that consider one or more ESG factors, but do not give them greater weight than other factors. The second main silo is focused funds. These are funds where ESG factors are a main or significant consideration for constructing an investment portfolio. Also, within focused funds is a subset called impact funds. And these are funds, as the classification suggests, that seek ESG-related changes from the companies they invest in.
How does this all work, Parker, with these different kind of ESG funds? Like, how does that impact our disclosures? What does it look like operationally?
Thanks, Philip. On a prospectus level, all ESG funds will be required to describe their ESG investment process. However, focused funds are subject to a heightened disclosure regime. That would include more detailed narrative on their ESG decision-making process and a standardized strategy overview table. The table is somewhat analogous to an FDA-mandated food nutrition label. So instead of seeing calories and sodium content like you would on the side of a can of soup, a fund's prospectus would require a check-the-box format covering various aspects of the ESG decision-making process. Specifically, a fund would have to use the check-the-box format to describe whether it tracks an ESG-related index, applies an exclusionary screen, seeks to achieve a specific impact, such as reducing pollution, and whether or not it uses proxy voting as a means to help achieve its goals, and whether it engages with issuer management to discuss the goals of the fund. And then there's also a catch-all of other where a fund would be able to describe any highly specific method it uses to execute its ESG-related strategy. Additionally, any fund that considers greenhouse gases as a part of the environmental dimension of ESG investing would also be required to provide some highly technical disclosures about greenhouse gas emissions related to the fund's portfolio, both on a primary, secondary, and tertiary level. These are extremely demanding and have not been terribly well received by the investment community because they require so much computational expertise. Moving over to the annual reports, on an annual report level, so-called impact funds are required to discuss any progress they've made in achieving their intended ESG impact. This would include both quantitative and qualitative measures, as well as key factors that affect the fund's ability to achieve its intended impact. Here, any ESG fund that relies significantly on proxy voting and or engagement with issuer management would also disclose its ESG-related proxy voting record and the meetings held with issuer management to discuss ESG goals. And then additionally, on an NSEN level, fund would report most of the information we just discussed, but would also have to indicate its classification as an integration fund, a focused fund, or an impact fund, note whether it follows an index, and note if the fund follows a third-party ESG framework.
So what's then now, Parker, the current status of the ESG rule?
Right now, the rule remains under review. The SEC has received what I can only describe as a multitude of comment letters and has held many, many investor meetings. As mentioned at the top of the call today, this rule remains under review. We don't have a good feel for its adoption. I will note that in the proposing release, it did say that investors could expect a one-year transition period for any elements of the rule that are adopted.
So we're really looking at 2025 at the earliest for these rules then for adoption, and then another a period before compliance. So potentially through end of 2025, maybe 2026.
That is certainly possible. So we wouldn't be surprised if we see some definitive adoption in 2024, but again, it's very hard to make a forecast on that.
Sure. Well, certainly more to come on ESG. I know that rule has been percolating for quite a few years now, quite frankly, as we kind of anticipate what it's going to look like and how it's going to impact like this ever increasingly popular trend of ESG investing. So more to come on ESG, more rules to come certainly from the SEC in 2024. Thank you, Parker and Randy, for sharing your insights today on the new rules. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. That concludes our coffee chat. Today's session was recorded, so if you would like to rewatch this session or any of our previous coffee chat sessions, you can do so by visiting the Thompson Hine channel on YouTube. Please subscribe to receive our latest content. Coffee chat is taking a little bit of a pause to celebrate the holidays, but will return in 2024. When the webinar ends, please take a few moments to complete a brief survey that will help us plan our programming for the future. We wish you all a very, very pleasant holiday season. Take care, everyone.